From the moment you drew your first breath, they began your programming, not with chains or cages, but with something far more insidious, the systematic cultivation of your weaknesses, disguised as virtues, the deliberate suppression of your power, masked as moral education, and the careful construction of psychological prisons that you would not only accept but defend as your freedom. Friedrich Nietzsche saw through this elaborate deception to reveal the most devastating truth about modern existence. You're being programmed to stay weak, and you're doing it to yourself. In the grand laboratory of human control, there exists no more perfect experiment than the systematic transformation of potentially powerful individuals into willing servants who celebrate their own limitations, police their own thoughts, and suppress their own greatness in service of systems designed to harvest their energy while preventing their transcendence. This is not the obvious tyranny of historical despots, but the sophisticated democracy of weakness that makes every citizen a prison guard for themselves and others. Tonight, we enter the revolutionary mind of Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who dared to diagnose the sickness at the heart of modern civilization, the deliberate cultivation of weakness as virtue, the systematic punishment of strength as vice, and the careful construction of moral frameworks that transform natural human excellence into social pathology. We will explore how your education programmed you to seek approval rather than achievement, how your culture conditioned you to choose safety over growth, and how your moral training taught you to suppress the very qualities that could liberate you from the systems that benefit from your voluntary servitude. Through Nietzsche's merciless analysis of slave morality that reveals how the weak have convinced the strong that strength is evil, through his understanding of resentment that shows how envy and inadequacy masquerade as moral superiority, through his concept of the last man who represents the final triumph of comfort over courage, safety over greatness, and collective mediocrity over individual excellence, through his vision of the Übermensch who transcends all programming to create values rather than inherit them, and through his recognition that breaking free from weakness programming requires nothing less than the complete revaluation of everything you've been taught to believe about virtue, success, and human potential, we will uncover the sophisticated mechanisms that have transformed you from a potential creator into a reliable consumer, from a possible leader into a predictable follower, from someone who could change the world into someone who accepts whatever world others create for their benefit. By the end of this Nietzschean awakening, you will understand why your gentleness serves others more than yourself, why your humility prevents the recognition you deserve, why your compliance enables the very systems you claim to oppose, and why learning to be strategically ruthless is not moral corruption, but the prerequisite for authentic moral action in a world designed to prevent such action from ever emerging. The question that will determine whether you remain trapped in programmed weakness or ascend to authentic power is this: are you ready to see how your virtues have become your chains, and are you strong enough to break those chains even when breaking them means disappointing everyone who benefits from your limitation? The architecture of weakness programming. Friedrich Nietzsche understood something that most people spend their lives avoiding. Modern civilization operates through the systematic cultivation of human weakness, disguised as moral development, social progress, and individual fulfillment. This cultivation is not accidental, but represents the most sophisticated form of control ever devised, making subjects complicit in their own limitation while believing they are pursuing their own liberation. The programming begins in childhood through educational systems that reward compliance over creativity, conformity over innovation, and accommodation over assertion. Children learn that being good means suppressing their natural drives for power, achievement, and self-expression in favor of behaviors that make them easy to manage, predictable to control, and useful to systems that require their energy more than their excellence. The school system operates as what Nietzsche would recognize as a factory for the production of weaklings, institutions designed to create individuals who look to external authorities for validation, who cannot function without constant supervision and approval, who measure their worth through others' recognition rather than their own achievements, and who believe that their value comes from serving collective needs rather than developing individual capabilities. Consider how this programming manifests in practice. Children who display natural leadership qualities are labeled as bossy and trained to suppress their directive instincts. Students who question authority are characterized as disruptive and conditioned to accept expert opinions without independent analysis. Individuals who pursue excellence beyond their peers are accused of showing off and pressured to limit themselves to levels that don't threaten others' comfort with mediocrity. Each of these interventions appears benevolent, teaching children to be considerate, cooperative, and modest, while actually preventing the development of psychological qualities that would enable them to resist manipulation, create independent value, and pursue authentic greatness rather than socially approved adequacy. The programming continues through cultural messaging that consistently portrays strength as dangerous, ambition as selfish, and individual excellence as antisocial. Movies, television, literature, and social media reinforce narratives where the strong are villains, the ambitious are corrupted, and the excellent are isolated, while the weak, humble, and average are portrayed as morally superior and ultimately victorious. These narratives serve a crucial control function by making strength itself appear morally questionable, while making weakness appear virtuous. The person who has internalized these messages will suppress their own capacity for power, achievement, and self-assertion, not because they lack these capabilities, but because they have been programmed to believe that exercising these capabilities makes them bad people. Religious and spiritual programming often reinforces weakness cultivation through teachings that glorify suffering, poverty, and self-sacrifice, while making prosperity, pleasure, and self-development appear spiritually dangerous. The faithful learn to suppress their desires for worldly success, material comfort, and individual recognition in favor of promised rewards in afterlife scenarios that conveniently cannot be verified or collected. This spiritual programming is particularly effective because it transforms weakness into a form of moral superiority that provides psychological satisfaction even when it produces practical failure. The person who accepts poverty feels morally superior to those who create wealth. The individual who suppresses ambition feels spiritually advanced beyond those who pursue achievement. The person who avoids power feels ethically pure compared to those who exercise influence. Political programming reinforces weakness through democratic ideologies that make individual excellence appear elitist, while making collective mediocrity appear egalitarian. Citizens learn to suppress their capacity for independent thinking in favor of group consensus, to avoid standing out from crowd opinions, and to measure political virtue through their willingness to sacrifice individual interests for collective goals that may serve power structures rather than citizen welfare. The cumulative effect of this multi-dimensional programming is the creation of what Nietzsche called the last man. Individuals who have become so thoroughly committed to comfort, safety, and approval that they have lost the capacity for greatness, courage, and authentic self-expression. These individuals will defend their own limitation because they have been programmed to experience limitation as virtue rather than recognizing it as the sophisticated slavery it actually represents. The inversion of values, making weakness appear strong. Nietzsche's most devastating insight concerned what he called the transvaluation of values, the systematic reversal of natural value hierarchies, so that qualities that indicate strength appear evil, while qualities that indicate weakness appear good. This inversion serves to disarm the potentially powerful, while making the actually powerless feel morally superior about their limitation. Consider how this inversion operates through specific value reversals that pervade modern culture. Humility is presented as virtue, while confidence is portrayed as arrogance, despite the reality that humility often represents fear of standing out, while confidence represents accurate self-assessment and willingness to take responsibility for outcomes. Self-sacrifice is glorified as noble, while self-development is characterized as selfish, despite the reality that self-sacrifice often represents inability to create enough value to serve others from abundance, while self-development creates the capabilities necessary for genuine contribution to others' welfare. Equality is promoted as justice, while excellence is condemned as elitism, despite the reality that forced equality often means bringing everyone down to the lowest common denominator, while excellence creates innovations and achievements that benefit everyone when properly implemented. Tolerance is praised as wisdom, while judgment is criticized as prejudice. Despite the reality that unlimited tolerance enables destructive behavior, while discriminating judgment protects valuable standards and productive relationships from those who would exploit or damage them. Cooperation is celebrated as virtue, while competition is denounced as harmful, despite the reality that cooperation without the option of competition often becomes exploitation of the productive by the unproductive, while healthy competition drives innovation and improvement that benefits everyone. Each of these value inversions serves the same function, preventing the development of psychological qualities that would enable individuals to resist manipulation, create independent value, and pursue authentic greatness, rather than collectively approved mediocrity. The person who has internalized these inverted values will suppress their natural drives for achievement, recognition, and power, not because these drives are inherently destructive, but because they have been programmed to believe that such drives make them morally inferior to those who lack the strength to pursue excellence. This programming is particularly insidious because it operates through the victim's own moral instincts. The person doesn't feel forced to suppress their strength. They feel morally obligated to suppress it because they have been taught that strength is selfish, while weakness is virtuous, that ambition is greedy, while contentment is wise, that standing out is arrogant, while blending in is humble. The psychological mechanism operates through what Nietzsche called bad conscience, the internalization of moral frameworks that make natural human drives for power and excellence feel guilty, shameful, and morally questionable. This internalized guilt becomes more effective than external control because it makes the person self-policing according to moral standards that serve their limitation rather than their development. Breaking free from value inversion requires what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values, the systematic examination of every moral belief to determine whether it serves human flourishing or human limitation, whether it enhances life or diminishes it, whether it promotes strength or cultivates weakness. This revaluation often reveals that many supposedly virtuous qualities actually serve systems that benefit from human limitation, while many supposedly dangerous qualities actually represent healthy human capabilities that have been demonized because they threaten existing power structures that depend on voluntary compliance rather than earned respect. The person who completes this revaluation discovers that authentic virtue often requires what appears to be vice according to inverted moral systems, that genuine kindness sometimes requires strategic cruelty, that real love sometimes demands tough boundaries, that actual justice sometimes involves harsh consequences for those who exploit others' goodness. The mechanisms of moral control. Nietzsche identified several sophisticated psychological mechanisms through which weakness programming operates to maintain control over potentially powerful individuals. These mechanisms are particularly effective because they operate through the victim's own moral instincts and desire to be good rather than through obvious external coercion that might provoke resistance. The guilt mechanism operates by making natural human drives for power, achievement, and self-expression feel morally questionable. The person experiences guilt when pursuing excellence because they have been programmed to believe that excellence makes others feel inadequate. Guilt when seeking recognition because they have been taught that recognition seeking is vanity. Guilt when exercising power because they have learned that power corrupts those who possess it. This guilt is not based on actual harm caused by strength, but on programmed associations between strength and moral failure that serve to prevent strength from developing. The guilty person will suppress their capabilities, not because those capabilities are destructive, but because exercising them feels morally wrong, according to internalized moral frameworks that serve limitation rather than development. The shame mechanism operates by making strength appear socially unacceptable rather than morally questionable. The person experiences shame when standing out from crowd norms, when achieving more than peers, when exercising authority that others lack, or when pursuing objectives that require individual initiative rather than group consensus. This shame serves to maintain social conformity that prevents anyone from rising far enough above the common level to threaten the comfortable assumption that limitation is inevitable rather than chosen. The shamed person will limit themselves not because limitation serves their interests, but because standing out from group norms feels socially dangerous. The fear mechanism operates by associating strength with negative consequences that may or may not be realistic. The person learns to fear success because it might create enemies, to fear power because it might corrupt them, to fear excellence because it might isolate them from others who cannot match their achievements. These fears often become self-fulfilling prophecies because the person's fear of strength prevents them from developing the wisdom necessary to exercise strength responsibly. The person who avoids power because they fear corruption never develops the experience necessary to use power constructively, making corruption more likely if they ever do achieve power. The distraction mechanism operates by providing endless entertainment, consumption opportunities, and social activities that consume the time and energy that might otherwise be invested in developing strength, capabilities, and authentic achievements that could threaten existing power structures. The distracted person remains busy with activities that feel productive, while actually preventing the focused effort necessary for significant achievement or personal development. They consume entertainment rather than creating value, participate in social activities rather than building meaningful capabilities, and pursue consumer satisfaction rather than authentic accomplishment. The comparison mechanism operates by creating competitive environments where people measure themselves against others rather than against their own potential, leading to either arrogance that stops development or inadequacy that prevents initiative. The person trapped in comparison will either become satisfied with being slightly better than others around them, preventing them from pursuing their full potential, or become discouraged by others who appear more advanced, preventing them from beginning development that might eventually surpass those others. Each of these mechanisms serves the same ultimate function, preventing the development of individual strength, capability, and independence that would enable people to create value outside existing systems, rather than remaining dependent on those systems for their survival, identity, and social connection. Breaking free from these mechanisms requires recognizing them as they operate in your own psychology and developing alternative responses that serve your development, rather than your limitation, your authentic interests, rather than system maintenance, your potential, rather than comfortable conformity to expectations that keep you predictable and controllable. The comfort trap: how safety prevents growth. One of Nietzsche's most penetrating insights concerned the way that comfort, safety, and security, seemingly positive conditions, actually serve to prevent the challenging experiences that are necessary for psychological and spiritual development. The comfortable person becomes addicted to comfort in ways that prevent them from pursuing the uncomfortable growth that would lead to authentic strength and capability. Modern civilization has perfected the art of providing just enough comfort to prevent rebellion, while maintaining just enough dissatisfaction to prevent contentment. This creates what Nietzsche would recognize as the last man psychology: people who are comfortable enough to avoid taking risks but dissatisfied enough to remain dependent on systems that promise future improvement in exchange for continued compliance. The comfort trap operates through several interconnected mechanisms that make challenging growth appear unnecessary, dangerous, or selfish, while making comfortable stagnation appear wise, safe, and socially responsible. Physical comfort prevents the development of resilience, discipline, and capability that emerge from voluntarily accepting physical challenges that build strength rather than merely maintaining current fitness levels. The person who avoids physical discomfort never develops the mental toughness that comes from pushing beyond current limitations. Emotional comfort prevents the development of psychological strength that emerges from facing difficult emotions, processing challenging experiences, and developing internal authority rather than seeking external validation for every decision and feeling. The emotionally comfortable person remains dependent on others for psychological stability, rather than developing the inner resources necessary for independence, authentic self-expression, and the ability to pursue objectives that others might not understand or support. Intellectual comfort prevents the development of critical thinking capabilities that emerge from questioning accepted beliefs, exploring controversial ideas, and developing independent understanding rather than accepting expert opinions without personal verification. The intellectually comfortable person remains vulnerable to manipulation through authorities who claim expertise while serving their own interests, rather than truth or the welfare of those who trust their pronouncements. Social comfort prevents the development of authentic relationships and genuine community that emerge from accepting the temporary discomfort of honest communication, boundary setting, and mutual challenge, rather than maintaining superficial harmony that prevents real intimacy and growth. The socially comfortable person remains trapped in relationships that feel pleasant, but don't provide the mutual development that makes relationships genuinely satisfying and meaningful over time. Economic comfort prevents the development of entrepreneurial skills, creative capabilities, and value creation abilities that emerge from accepting the risks and uncertainties involved in creating independent income, rather than trading time and freedom for the security of employment that may not serve long-term interests. The economically comfortable person remains dependent on others for financial survival rather than developing the capabilities necessary to create value independently and build wealth that provides genuine security rather than the illusion of security that employment provides. The comfort trap is particularly insidious because it feels like success while actually representing the prevention of development that would lead to much greater satisfaction, capability, and authentic achievement. The comfortable person doesn't feel limited because their limitation is surrounded by enough pleasant distractions to prevent recognition of what they're missing. Breaking free from comfort addiction requires what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, including the difficult fate of voluntarily accepting discomfort that serves growth rather than remaining trapped in comfort that prevents development. This means choosing challenging experiences that build strength rather than easy experiences that maintain current limitations. The person who breaks free from comfort addiction discovers that voluntary discomfort in service of growth provides far more satisfaction than involuntary comfort in service of limitation. They learn to embrace challenge as opportunity rather than avoiding it as threat, to see obstacles as development opportunities rather than problems to be solved by others. The herd mentality, collective weakness, as individual prism. Nietzsche's concept of herd morality reveals how collective weakness becomes individual limitation through social pressure that makes conformity to group limitations appear virtuous, while making individual transcendence appear selfish or antisocial. This herd mentality serves as perhaps the most effective mechanism for maintaining weakness programming because it operates through peer pressure rather than authority pressure. The herd cannot tolerate individual excellence because such excellence threatens their comfortable assumption that their limitations are inevitable rather than chosen. When someone transcends common limitations, it suggests that others could do the same if they were willing to pay the price that transcendence requires. This possibility creates anxiety in those who prefer their comfortable limitations to uncomfortable growth. The herd responds to individual excellence not with inspiration, but with what Nietzsche called resentment, a poisonous combination of envy, inadequacy, and moral superiority that seeks to bring exceptional individuals down to common levels rather than rising to meet them. This resentment manifests through criticism, designed to make excellence appear morally questionable rather than inspiring. Consider how herd mentality operates through specific social pressures that prevent individual development. The person who pursues excellence beyond their peers will face accusations of showing off, being arrogant, or thinking they're better than everyone else. These accusations serve to create social costs for transcendence, while providing social benefits for remaining limited to levels that don't threaten others' comfort with mediocrity. The individual who develops independent thinking that differs from group consensus will face social isolation, criticism, and pressure to conform to collective opinions, regardless of whether those opinions serve truth, justice, or practical effectiveness. The herd prefers comfortable falsehoods to challenging truths, because falsehoods allow them to remain limited, while truths might require growth that feels threatening. The person who pursues authentic values that differ from cultural norms will encounter moral pressure, designed to make their authentic values appear selfish while making cultural conformity appear virtuous, regardless of whether cultural norms actually serve human flourishing or simply maintain social stability that prevents anyone from transcending common limitations. Herd mentality also operates through what psychologists call social proof, the tendency to determine appropriate behavior by observing what others do, rather than through independent analysis of what serves authentic interests and values. This social proof mechanism makes individual excellence appear abnormal, rather than admirable, unusual, rather than inspiring. The person trapped in herd mentality will limit their own development to match the development level of their social group, rather than pursuing their full potential, will suppress authentic values that differ from group norms, even when those values are more ethical and practical than group standards, and will avoid pursuing excellence that might create social distance from others who prefer collective mediocrity. Breaking free from herd mentality requires what Nietzsche called the courage of one's convictions, the psychological strength to pursue authentic development, even when such pursuit creates social isolation, criticism, and pressure to return to comfortable conformity with group limitations. This courage necessarily involves what Nietzsche called the loneliness of greatness, the temporary social isolation that results from transcending common limitations while others remain bound by those limitations. This loneliness is not pathological, but represents the natural consequence of growth that moves beyond what others can understand or support. The person who develops beyond herd limitations discovers that this temporary loneliness eventually leads to connection with others who have also transcended common limitations, creating relationships based on mutual excellence rather than mutual limitation, authentic values rather than inherited norms, individual strength rather than collective weakness. The goal is not to become antisocial, but to become selective about social connections, investing time and energy in relationships that support mutual development rather than mutual limitation, authentic expression rather than conformist performance, individual greatness rather than collective mediocrity. Educational programming, creating compliant workers. Nietzsche understood that educational systems serve as the primary mechanism for programming weakness because they operate during the developmental years when psychological patterns are most malleable and when young people are most susceptible to authority-based programming disguised as knowledge transmission and character development. The modern educational system operates on principles that Nietzsche would recognize as designed to create compliant workers rather than independent thinkers, obedient citizens rather than creative leaders, and predictable consumers rather than innovative entrepreneurs. This programming appears educational while actually preventing the development of capabilities that would enable students to create independent value rather than remaining dependent on systems that benefit from their compliance. Consider how educational programming manifests through specific institutional practices that appear beneficial while actually limiting development. Students learn to seek external validation through grades rather than developing internal standards based on authentic achievement and personal satisfaction. This external validation dependency creates adults who cannot function without constant supervision and approval from authorities who may not have their best interests at heart. The curriculum emphasizes memorization and repetition rather than critical thinking and creative problem-solving, creating students who can reproduce information but cannot generate original insights or innovative solutions to complex problems. This reproductive rather than creative emphasis produces workers who can follow instructions but cannot provide leadership when circumstances require adaptation rather than compliance. Standardized testing measures conformity to predetermined answers rather than the ability to ask penetrating questions, develop original solutions, or think independently about complex issues. Students learn that success means giving authorities what they want, rather than developing authentic understanding or pursuing genuine curiosity about subjects that interest them. Classroom management emphasizes obedience to authority rather than developing personal responsibility, self-discipline, and the ability to make good decisions without external supervision. Students learn to comply with rules because authorities enforce them, rather than developing internal moral reasoning that would enable ethical behavior based on principle rather than fear of punishment. Social programming within schools emphasizes fitting in with peer groups rather than developing individual identity, authentic self-expression, and the courage to stand out when circumstances require leadership rather than followership. Students learn that social acceptance requires conformity to group norms, even when those norms conflict with their authentic values or individual development. Career guidance emphasizes finding jobs within existing systems rather than developing entrepreneurial skills, creative capabilities, and value creation abilities that would enable students to create their own opportunities rather than depending on others to provide employment that serves employer interests more than employee development. The cumulative effect of this educational programming is the production of adults who cannot function without external authority, who seek validation through others' approval rather than personal achievement, who follow instructions rather than creating innovative solutions, and who consume opportunities created by others rather than generating opportunities through their own creativity and initiative. Breaking free from educational programming requires what Nietzsche called self-education, the systematic development of capabilities that formal education neglected or actively suppressed. This self-education involves developing critical thinking skills that enable independent analysis rather than accepting expert opinions without verification. It requires building creative capabilities that enable original contribution rather than reproductive compliance with existing systems, developing entrepreneurial skills that enable value creation rather than job-seeking within systems controlled by others, and cultivating authentic self-expression rather than conformist divine to win social approval. Most importantly, self-education involves developing what Nietzsche called intellectual conscience, the commitment to truth and understanding regardless of whether truth serves your preferences or social expectations, regardless of whether understanding is comfortable or challenging, regardless of whether intellectual development requires abandoning beliefs that provided psychological comfort but may not serve authentic wisdom. Economic enslavement, debt as control. Nietzsche anticipated how economic systems would evolve to create what he would recognize as the most sophisticated form of slavery ever devised, voluntary economic dependence that makes freedom appear financially impossible, while making continued servitude appear economically necessary. This economic programming operates through debt, consumption culture, and employment structures that extract maximum value from human energy while providing minimum autonomy over time and choices. The debt-based economy creates what economists call debt slavery, a condition where individuals must work to service debts that require continued borrowing to maintain lifestyle standards that have been culturally programmed as necessary for social acceptance and personal satisfaction. This creates endless cycles where people work to pay for things they were programmed to want, rather than pursuing authentic objectives that might require less money but provide more genuine satisfaction. Consider how this programming operates through specific mechanisms that appear to provide opportunity while actually creating dependence. Student loans promise educational advancement while creating decades of debt that force graduates to pursue high-paying jobs regardless of whether those jobs serve their authentic interests or values. Graduates become unable to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities, creative projects, or value-driven work because they must prioritize debt service over meaningful contribution. Mortgages promise home ownership while creating 30-year commitments that force borrowers to maintain steady employment, regardless of job satisfaction, employer ethics, or career development opportunities. The mortgage holder becomes trapped in employment that serves debt obligations rather than personal development or authentic contribution to meaningful work. Consumer credit promises immediate gratification, while creating ongoing payment obligations that force consumers to work more hours to afford lifestyle standards that were manufactured through marketing rather than chosen through authentic preference. The consumer becomes trapped in cycles where they work to pay for things they may not actually value if given time for reflection about authentic priorities. Employment structures promise security while creating dependence on others for income, identity, and social status. The employee trades time and freedom for money and benefits, while developing no independent value creation capabilities that would enable financial independence or entrepreneurial opportunities. This economic programming is reinforced through cultural messaging that makes debt appear normal, consumption appear fulfilling, and employment appear secure, while making financial independence appear unrealistic, simple living appear deprived, and entrepreneurship appear risky for ordinary people. The person trapped in economic programming will suppress their authentic interests in favor of economically profitable activities, will avoid pursuing meaningful work in favor of well-paying jobs, and will sacrifice time with family and personal development for income that enables lifestyle maintenance but prevents lifestyle choice. Breaking free from economic programming requires what Nietzsche would call economic self-overcoming, the systematic reduction of economic dependencies that force compromise of authentic values, and the development of independent value creation capabilities that enable choice rather than compulsion in work and lifestyle decisions. This liberation involves distinguishing between genuine needs and manufactured wants, between investments that increase independence and expenses that increase dependence, between work that serves authentic development and jobs that serve only financial obligations created through programmed consumption. The economically liberated person can choose work based on alignment with values rather than salary levels, can pursue entrepreneurial opportunities without risking financial survival, and can make lifestyle choices based on authentic preferences rather than cultural expectations that require debt financing to maintain. Economic liberation also enables what Nietzsche called noble selfishness, the ability to serve others from abundance rather than serving them from neediness, to contribute value because you choose to rather than because you must for survival, to build wealth that enhances your capacity for authentic contribution rather than accumulating possessions that diminish your freedom through maintenance requirements. The path to strength. Breaking the programming. Understanding the mechanisms of weakness programming is only the beginning. Implementing Nietzschean strength requires systematic practices that gradually replace programmed weakness responses with authentic strength behaviors. This transformation cannot happen through intellectual understanding alone, but requires what Nietzsche called physiological change, alterations in your fundamental patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting that operate at levels deeper than conscious decision-making. Developing value independence. Begin by identifying every moral belief, social norm, and cultural expectation you have inherited without conscious examination. Ask penetrating questions about each belief. Does this actually serve human flourishing, or does it serve systems that benefit from human limitation? Does this enhance my capabilities or constrain them? Does this promote life or diminish it? This revaluation process often reveals that many supposedly virtuous beliefs actually serve weakness rather than strength, limitation rather than development, system maintenance rather than human flourishing. The person who completes this process develops what Nietzsche called intellectual conscience, commitment to truth, regardless of whether truth is comfortable, socially acceptable, or psychologically convenient. Value independence means making moral decisions based on your understanding of what enhances life, rather than on inherited moral frameworks that may serve control rather than genuine ethical development. This independence allows authentic moral choice, rather than moral compliance with standards you never consciously chose. Building physical and mental toughness. Systematically expose yourself to voluntary discomfort that builds strength rather than accepting comfort that maintains weakness. This might involve physical challenges that develop resilience, intellectual challenges that develop independent thinking, or emotional challenges that develop psychological strength. Physical toughness involves accepting voluntary physical discomfort through exercise, challenging activities or lifestyle choices that build capability rather than maintaining current comfort levels. This toughness transfers to mental and emotional resilience because it demonstrates your capacity to choose growth over comfort. Mental toughness involves pursuing intellectual challenges that expand your understanding, even when such challenges disturb comfortable beliefs or require significant effort to master. This might involve studying difficult subjects, learning demanding skills, or engaging with ideas that challenge your worldview. Emotional toughness involves accepting responsibility for your emotional responses rather than seeking others to manage your emotional comfort, facing difficult emotions rather than avoiding them through distraction or substances, and developing internal emotional regulation rather than depending on external circumstances for psychological stability. Cultivating creative power. Develop the ability to create value rather than only consuming value created by others. This creation might involve artistic expression, entrepreneurial ventures, innovative problem-solving, or any activity that generates something useful rather than simply consuming resources without producing corresponding benefit. Creative power breaks dependence on systems that control access to opportunities, provides alternative sources of income and identity that reduce vulnerability to economic manipulation, and develops confidence that comes from knowing you can create rather than only consume. The creative person becomes less susceptible to weakness programming because they have developed independent sources of satisfaction, meaning, and capability that don't depend on others' approval or system-provided opportunities. Accepting selective isolation. Develop comfort with being alone and being different from others when authenticity requires such difference. This isolation is not permanent antisocial behavior, but temporary separation necessary for developing strength that others may not understand or support during development phases. Selective isolation allows space for authentic self-development without constant pressure to conform to others' limitations, provides opportunity for independent thinking without group pressure to accept collective opinions, and creates conditions for developing internal authority rather than remaining dependent on external validation. The person who can tolerate selective isolation becomes immune to social pressure that would otherwise force them to suppress authentic development to maintain relationships that require their limitation as the price of inclusion. Practicing strategic assertion. Learn to assert your authentic interests, boundaries, and standards, even when such assertion creates conflict or disappointment for others who prefer your accommodation to your authenticity. This assertion must be strategic rather than arbitrary, serving authentic purposes rather than simply expressing defiance for its own sake. Strategic assertion involves saying no to requests that don't serve mutual benefit, establishing boundaries around your time and energy that protect your authentic development, and pursuing objectives that serve your values rather than others' expectations for your choices. This practice gradually builds the psychological strength necessary for authentic self-expression, while reducing dependence on others' approval for decision-making authority. Developing economic independence. Build financial resilience that reduces your vulnerability to economic programming through debt reduction, lifestyle simplification, and development of independent income sources that align with your authentic interests, rather than just providing maximum salary. Economic independence enables authentic choice about work, lifestyle, and relationships because it reduces the economic pressures that force compromise of values for survival, accommodation of poor treatment for income, or acceptance of meaningless work for financial security. The economically independent person can pursue authentic objectives without being constrained by financial dependencies that serve others' interests more than their own development. Nietzsche's vision, the Übermensch's antidote. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch represents not a superhuman being, but simply a human being who has overcome the programming that keeps most people weak, dependent, and limited to possibilities that serve system maintenance rather than human flourishing. The Übermensch is the person you could become if you had the courage to break free from everything designed to keep you controllable. The Übermensch creates their own values rather than inheriting moral systems that may serve weakness rather than strength, limitation rather than development, system maintenance rather than human transcendence. This value creation is not arbitrary, but based on deep understanding of what actually enhances life, rather than what appears virtuous, according to programming designed to prevent life enhancement. This self-created morality serves authentic human development rather than social control, promotes individual excellence rather than collective mediocrity, and enhances life rather than managing comfort. The Übermensch becomes a moral innovator rather than a moral follower, creating ethical frameworks that serve transcendence rather than accepting ethical limitations that prevent growth. The Übermensch accepts complete responsibility for their choices and outcomes rather than blaming circumstances, other people, or social conditions for limitations that may actually result from their own failure to develop capabilities that would enable transcendence of those limitations. This responsibility acceptance eliminates victim mentality that keeps people trapped in resentment rather than motivating them toward development that would resolve their problems through strength rather than hoping others will solve their problems through accommodation. The Übermensch develops what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, including difficult fate that requires strength to navigate successfully. This love includes accepting the challenging aspects of authentic living rather than seeking comfortable alternatives that prevent development. The person who develops amor fati stops wishing their circumstances were different and starts developing the capabilities necessary to thrive in whatever circumstances they face, while working strategically to improve those circumstances through their own effort rather than others' assistance. The Übermensch experiences what Nietzsche called the eternal recurrence, the willingness to live their exact life infinite times because they have created a life worth living through their own choices, rather than accepting whatever life others create for their convenience. This willingness to repeat their life exactly indicates that they have broken free from programming that would make such repetition unbearable, that they have developed strength that makes challenges manageable rather than overwhelming, that they have created meaning that makes effort worthwhile rather than meaningless. The path to becoming Übermensch is not about perfection, but about continuous development beyond whatever limitations currently constrain you, whether those limitations come from external circumstances or internal programming that makes transcendence appear impossible, dangerous, or morally questionable. Nietzsche's ultimate wake-up call. Friedrich Nietzsche's ultimate message crystallizes into a recognition that may initially seem overwhelming, but ultimately proves liberating. You are being programmed to stay weak, not by obviously evil forces, but by systems that appear beneficial while actually preventing your development, by moral frameworks that appear virtuous while actually serving limitation, by social institutions that appear helpful while actually creating dependence. This programming is sophisticated precisely because it operates through your own desires to be good, safe, and socially acceptable, rather than through obvious coercion that might provoke resistance. The programming succeeds because it makes weakness feel like virtue, while making strength feel like selfishness, makes limitation feel like wisdom, while making transcendence feel like arrogance. Breaking free from this programming requires what Nietzsche called the courage to become who you are, the willingness to develop your authentic capabilities despite social pressure to remain limited, to pursue excellence despite cultural messages that make excellence appear antisocial, to accept strength despite moral frameworks that make strength appear dangerous. This courage cannot be borrowed or shared. It must be developed through repeated practice of choosing authenticity over approval, growth over comfort, strength over the safety that prevents development of capabilities you would need to create genuine security, rather than depending on others for protection they may not be able or willing to provide. The person who awakens to Nietzschean reality discovers that their weakness was not inevitable, but programmed, not natural but imposed, not beneficial but limiting in ways they had never recognized while trapped within systems designed to benefit from their voluntary compliance with expectations that served others more than themselves. This awakening reveals that your potential is far greater than you have been programmed to believe, that your capabilities extend far beyond what systems need from you, that your possibilities transcend what others find comfortable or convenient to acknowledge and support. Most importantly, this awakening shows that the choice between strength and weakness is always yours to make, regardless of external circumstances, programming attempts, or social pressure to remain limited to levels that others can understand and control. You can continue accepting programming that keeps you weak, dependent, and useful to systems that benefit from your limitation while providing you with just enough comfort to prevent rebellion. Or you can begin the challenging, but ultimately liberating process of developing the strength that would make such programming ineffective against you. Nietzsche's wake-up call is simple but profound. You're being programmed to stay weak, but you have the power to break that programming and discover what you're actually capable of when you stop accepting limits that were imposed rather than inevitable, chosen rather than necessary, beneficial to others rather than beneficial to your authentic development. The programming ends when you decide it ends. Your strength begins when you choose to develop it, despite everything designed to prevent such development from occurring. Wake up, break free, become who you actually are when you stop being who others programmed you to be. Your authentic power is waiting on the other side of your willingness to disappoint everyone who benefits from your limitation. Cross that threshold, claim your strength, fulfill your potential. Nietzsche's wake-up call has been delivered. Your response determines whether you remain programmed for weakness or reprogram yourself for the strength that has always been your birthright. The choice is yours. Choose strength. Choose growth. Choose the courage to become who you are when you stop being who others need you to be for their comfort and convenience. You're being programmed to stay weak. Stop accepting the programming. Start claiming your power. Begin now.